a growing terror that she tried to suppress, but could not entirely silence, because she was falling in love with Sebastian Wentworth, and she knew with absolute certainty that such a love was impossible, doomed, a fantasy that could only end in heartbreak. He was a duke, one of the most powerful men in England, and she was a penniless servant with a stolen inheritance and a decade of erasure behind her. And even if he helped her recover her money, she would still be gentry at best, a woman of modest means and no particular family, utterly unsuitable as a wife for a man of his rank. She told herself that his interest was purely charitable, that he was helping her because he was fundamentally decent and found her situation outrageous, that the kindness he showed her was the same kindness he would show to any victim of injustice. But there were moments when she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something in his eyes that suggested his feelings might be more complicated than simple benevolence, and those moments terrified her because they gave her hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing she could allow herself. In his own study across London, Sebastian sat with Mr. Henshaw and reviewed the results of the investigation with a growing sense of fury that made his hands shake as he turned the pages of documented evidence. "Your Grace," the solicitor said, his tone carefully neutral, "the evidence is incontrovertible." Lord Whitmore forged documents claiming that investments made on behalf of Miss Fairfax's trust had failed catastrophically. He produced false reports from non-existent firms. He created an entire paper trail of fictional losses, but the money, all £8,000 of it, was in fact transferred directly to his personal accounts over the course of 18 months beginning in the spring of 1848. The funds were used to pay his gambling debts, to maintain the household beyond his means, to purchase jewellery for Lady Whitmore and gowns for Miss Lydia, Miss Tsar. Fairfax's inheritance was quite literally stolen to support the lifestyle of the family that claimed to be providing for her out of charity. Sebastian felt sick with rage, his usual careful control slipping as he absorbed the full extent of the Whitmores' theft and deception. "Can we prosecute?" he asked, his voice tight. "We can," Mr. Henshaw replied. "The evidence is more than sufficient for criminal charges, forgery, embezzlement, fraud. Lord Whitmore would almost certainly be convicted and could face imprisonment, though I must warn your Grace that such a prosecution would be a tremendous scandal. The Whitmores would be utterly ruined socially as well as legally, and Miss Fairfax herself would be subjected to intense public scrutiny. Her personal circumstances would be examined in court. In the newspapers, she would have no privacy, no protection from speculation and gossip." Sebastian was silent, considering the implications. The cost of justice weighed against the cost of mercy. "What is Miss Fairfax legally entitled to?" he asked finally. "The full amount of the original inheritance plus interest calculated at the standard rate over the intervening decade," Mr. Henshaw said, consulting his notes, "which comes to nearly £10,000. Additionally, she could claim compensation for lost wages if we can establish that her position in the Whitmore household was coerced servitude rather than voluntary employment, which the evidence strongly suggests." £10,000. Sebastian thought. Enough to make Arabella independent, enough to give her choices, enough to restore not just her money, but her autonomy, her ability to determine her own future. He thanked Mr. Henshaw and dismissed him with instructions to prepare the documentation, but to take no further action until Sebastian gave the word. And when he was alone in his study, he pressed his hands against his face and tried to understand what he was feeling. This tangle of rage at the Whitmores and protectiveness toward Arabella. And something else, something deeper and more personal that he had been trying not to acknowledge. He was falling in love with her, he realized. And the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying because he had not intended this. had not meant to feel anything beyond the righteous anger of a man witnessing injustice, but somewhere between the park and the library and the garden conversations, he had stopped seeing her as a victim to be rescued, and started seeing her as simply Arabella, a woman of extraordinary strength and intelligence and quiet grace. A woman who made him laugh with her dry observations, who challenged his assumptions, who looked at him as though he were Sebastian rather than the Duke, a person rather than a title. He wanted her, not in the casual way he had occasionally wanted other women, not as a mistress or a temporary amusement, but completely, permanently, as a wife, as a partner, as the person he came home to and shared his life with. And the wanting was so intense, it frightened him because he did not know if she could ever see him as anything other than the Duke who had helped her, whether she could separate whatever gratitude she might feel from genuine affection, whether the power imbalance between them was too great to ever be fully overcome. The investigation continued, and the spring deepened into early summer, and Sebastian found himself spending more and more time at the Whitmore house, drawn there by the prospect of seeing Arabella, of hearing her voice, of watching her slowly come back to life, like the garden coming back from winter. Lydia noticed, her jealousy obvious in the sharpness of her comments, the way she monopolized Sebastian's attention at dinner, and sulked when he turned the conversation to topics that interested Arabella, literature and philosophy, and the political debates happening in Parliament. Lady Whitmore noticed, too, her anxiety manifesting in increasingly desperate attempts to throw Lydia and Sebastian together, to create opportunities for private conversation, to engineer the kind of romantic scenarios that might lead to a proposal. But Sebastian deflected them all with the skill of a man who had been avoiding ambitious mothers for 15 years. Lord Whitmore was the most visibly uncomfortable, his manner toward Sebastian shifting from obsequious friendliness to wary suspicion, and Sebastian knew the older man sensed danger, sensed that his secrets were no longer secure. But Lord Whitmore could not act on his suspicions without revealing that he had something to hide. And so he remained trapped in a performance of hospitality while his household crumbled around him. One evening in late May, Sebastian requested tea in the study, and when Arabella brought it, he asked her to stay, to sit with him for a moment. And she did, perching nervously on the edge of a chair while he poured for both of them, a reversal of servant and served that made her deeply uncomfortable. "The investigation is complete," he said without preamble, keeping his voice low so it would not carry beyond the closed door. "Mr. Henshaw has found everything we need, documentation of the forged investment claims, records of the money being transferred to Lord Whitmore's accounts, proof that your inheritance was stolen." Arabella's hands trembled as she set down her teacup, her face going pale. "All of it," she whispered. "He took all of it." "All of it," Sebastian confirmed. £8,000 plus interest. You are legally entitled to nearly £10,000, Arabella. You are not penniless. You never were. You were robbed. She pressed her hands to her face, and he saw tears leaking between her fingers. But when she looked up at him, her expression was not defeated, but fierce, determined. "What do we do now?" she asked. And the "we" in that question, the assumption of partnership, made Sebastian's heart clench with an emotion he could not quite name. "Now," he said gently, "we decide how you want to proceed. We can prosecute, can bring criminal charges, can see Lord Whitmore imprisoned for his crimes, but such a course would be public and painful, and would subject you to scrutiny you might find unbearable, or we can pursue a quieter resolution, can confront the Whitmores privately and demand restitution, can threaten prosecution to force them to return your inheritance without the spectacle of a trial. Either way, Arabella, the choice is yours. I will support whatever you decide." She looked at him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face, and then she said something that took his breath away. "Why are you doing this, Sebastian? Truly, what am I to you that you would invest so much time and effort in my troubles?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, and impossible to answer with anything less than equal honesty, and Sebastian felt himself standing at a precipice, knowing that what he said next would determine everything that followed. "You are," he began, and then stopped, searching for words adequate to the truth. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Arabella Fairfax, and I am doing this not out of duty or charity, but because I cannot bear to see you treated unjustly, because your happiness matters to me, because you matter to me in ways that have nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with—" He paused, gathering his courage. "Everything to do with how I feel about you, which is more than I should feel and less than I want to say." The confession hung between them like a living thing, and Arabella stared at him with wide eyes, her expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like pain. "You cannot mean that," she said, her voice shaking. "I am nobody, Sebastian. I am a servant in a house that stole my inheritance. I am a woman without standing or connections or anything to recommend me. You are a duke. You could marry anyone. Why would you?" She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. "Because when I am with you, I feel more myself than I have ever felt in company," Sebastian said simply. "Because you see me, Arabella, not the title or the wealth or the social position, but me, Sebastian, just a man who happens to be a duke, but is still just a man underneath all the trappings. And when you say my name, it sounds like the truth instead of a formality." Arabella was crying again, silent tears streaming down her face, and Sebastian wanted to go to her, to take her in his arms, but he forced himself to remain where he was, to give her space to feel whatever she was feeling, without the pressure of his physical presence. "I am afraid," she whispered, "afraid that this is not real, that I am misunderstanding, that you will realize what a mistake it would be to bind yourself to someone like me, and I will be left more alone than I was before, because I will have let myself hope." "Then let me be clear," Sebastian said, his voice steady and sure. "I am not offering you charity, Arabella. I am offering you my heart. I am in love with you, and whatever happens with the inheritance, whatever you decide about the Whitmores, whatever path you choose for your future, I want to walk it with you if you will have me, not as your benefactor, but as your partner, your equal, your choice freely made." The words settled into the quiet study like a benediction, and Arabella looked at him with an expression of such wonder and terror and tentative joy that Sebastian felt his own eyes prickling with tears he refused to shed. And in that moment, everything hung in balance, the future waiting to be determined by what she said next. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in early June, and Sebastian arrived at the Whitmore townhouse with Mr. Henshaw and a leather portfolio containing enough documented evidence to destroy the family's reputation and possibly send Lord Whitmore to prison. And as he climbed the steps to the front door, he felt a cold fury settle over him like armor, the kind of ducal authority he rarely deployed, but which came naturally when justice demanded it. The butler showed them into the drawing-room, where Lord and Lady Whitmore waited with expressions that attempted nonchalance, but could not quite conceal their anxiety, and Lydia hovered near the window looking pale and frightened, sensing that something significant was about to occur, though she did not yet understand what. Sebastian did not sit when invited, did not accept the offer of refreshment, did not engage in any of the social pleasantries that usually preceded business. Instead, he stood in the center of the room with Mr. Henshaw beside him and said in a voice that permitted no argument, "Please send for Miss Arabella Fairfax. Her presence is required for this discussion." Lady Whitmore's face went white and then red, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. And Lord Whitmore blustered, "I fail to see why a servant should be present for a private meeting, Your Grace. Surely whatever business you have with us can be conducted without." But Sebastian cut him off with a look of such cold disdain that the older man fell silent mid-sentence. "Miss Fairfax is not your servant," Sebastian said, each word precise and sharp as a blade. "She is the wronged party in a matter of theft and fraud that I am here to address, and she will be present to hear what I have to say and to make her own decisions about how to proceed. Now send for her immediately, or I will go find her myself." The threat hung in the air, and after a moment of frozen silence, Lord Whitmore gestured sharply to the butler, who departed, and returned moments later with Arabella, her face carefully blank, but her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She entered the drawing-room and stopped just inside the door, and Sebastian saw her taking in the scene, the Whitmores seated on the sofa looking like defendants at a trial, Mr. Henshaw with his portfolio of documents, Sebastian himself standing in a position of authority, and he saw the moment she understood that this was it, the confrontation they had discussed, the reckoning that would determine her future. "Please come in, Arabella," Sebastian said gently, using her Christian name deliberately to establish her status as a person rather than a servant. "And come stand here beside me. You should hear everything that is said." She crossed the room slowly, her worn grey dress incongruous in the elegant drawing-room, and she took her position at Sebastian's side, and he felt rather than saw her draw herself up straighter, felt her gathering her courage like a cloak around her shoulders. "Lord Whitmore," Sebastian began, his voice cold and formal, "I have here documentation proving that you embezzled £8,000 from Miss Arabella Fairfax's trust fund over the course of 1848 to 1849. You forged investment reports. You created false claims of catastrophic losses. You transferred her entire inheritance to your personal accounts and used those funds to pay gambling debts, to maintain a household beyond your means, to purchase luxuries for your family. You then coerced Miss Fairfax, who was 18 years old, orphaned and dependent on your goodwill, into accepting a position as a servant in your household under the pretense that her money had been lost through legitimate investment failures. You have for 10 years benefited from her unpaid labor while allowing her to believe she had no other options, no other recourse, that she should be grateful for your charity when in fact you were the one who had stolen her ability to be independent." The words fell into the drawing-room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and horror across the faces of everyone present except Mr. Henshaw, who had heard it all before, and Arabella, who had lived it. Lord Whitmore surged to his feet, his face purple with rage or perhaps fear. "This is outrageous!" he shouted. "Who do you think you are, coming into my home and making these vile accusations? I would never! My investments on behalf of Miss Fairfax were made in good faith, and if they failed, that is the nature of investment, not fraud. You have no right to." But Sebastian's voice cut across his blustering with the authority of centuries of aristocratic power. "I am the Duke of Ashford," he said, and each word was cold as winter. "And I am a magistrate. I have both the social standing and the legal authority to bring these charges. You will address me with the respect my position demands, and you will answer for your crimes. The evidence is incontrovertible. Mr. Henshaw has documentation of every fraudulent transaction, copies of the forged investment reports, records of the transfers to your accounts, testimony from bank officials and clerks. You are caught, Lord Whitmore, and your only choice now is whether you face these charges in a public court or whether you make immediate and full restitution." Lady Whitmore found her voice then, shrill with desperation. "Crimes," she spat. "That girl has been clothed and fed for 10 years, housed and provided for. If there was any misunderstanding about investments, that is hardly grounds for such dramatic accusations. She has obviously been filling your Grace's head with lies, manipulating your sympathy with tales of mistreatment, when the truth is we have been more than generous to an orphan who had nowhere else to go." Arabella spoke then, her voice quiet but steady, and Sebastian felt a surge of pride at her composure. "As a servant," she said, "earning wages you never paid, living in an attic room barely large enough for a bed, forbidden to speak my own name, forbidden to read the books in your library, forbidden to exist as anything other than an invisible pair of hands to lace your corsets and fetch your shawls. You clothed me in rags and fed me on scraps, and called it charity, while you spent my inheritance on jewels and gowns and gambling debts. Do not speak to me of generosity when you stole everything my parents worked to provide for me." The colour drained from Lady Whitmore's face and then flooded back as fury overcame caution. "You ungrateful whore," she hissed. "You have seduced the Duke to destroy us. You have used your availability, your willingness to debase yourself, to turn him against us. This is your revenge for imagined slights, for being asked to contribute to the household that took you in, you manipulative little—" But Sebastian's hand came down hard on the table, the crack of it silencing her mid-sentence. "Madam," he said, and his voice was ice and iron, "I suggest you silence yourself before you say something actionable. Miss Fairfax has manipulated nothing, has seduced no one. I became aware of her situation through my own observations, through witnessing how your family treated her, through asking questions about why a woman of obvious education and refinement was working as an unnamed servant. The evidence speaks for itself. Miss Fairfax's character is not in question. Yours is." The room fell into charged silence, and Arabella turned to look at Lady Whitmore directly, and when she spoke her voice was clear and strong and absolutely certain. "I have seduced no one," she said. "I have simply remembered who I am. I am Arabella Fairfax, daughter of Emmeline Fairfax, née Gardiner, and Thomas Fairfax. I was raised as a lady, educated as a lady, promised a future and an inheritance. You stole my inheritance. You stole my name. You stole 10 years of my life. His Grace has simply helped me reclaim what was always mine, what you had no right to take." Lady Whitmore looked as though she wanted to respond, but could find no words, and Lord Whitmore had sunk back onto the sofa, his earlier bluster completely deflated, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Sebastian allowed the silence to stretch, let the weight of the accusations settle, and then he continued in a voice that permitted no negotiation. "You have 2 choices," he said. "You will restore Miss Fairfax's inheritance in full, the original £8,000 plus interest calculated over 10 years, which brings the total to nearly £10,000. Additionally, you will provide compensation for 10 years of unpaid wages, not as a servant, but as a companion, which was her proper status. Mr. Henshaw has calculated that amount at an additional £2,000. You will transfer these funds to Miss Fairfax within 1 week, and you will provide her with a formal letter acknowledging the debt and its payment. Or," and here his voice dropped even lower, even colder, "I will bring criminal charges of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. I will ensure that every newspaper in London reports the details of your theft. I will see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and I will use every bit of my influence to ensure that you are socially ruined, that no door in society opens to you ever again, that your name becomes synonymous with theft and cruelty. The choice is yours, but you will make it now." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and Lydia's quiet sobbing from her position by the window. Lord Whitmore looked at his wife, at Sebastian, at Arabella, and in his eyes Sebastian saw the exact moment when he accepted defeat, when he understood that he had no cards left to play, no bluffs that would work, no escape from the consequences of his crimes. "We will pay," he said, his voice barely audible. "We will make restitution as you demand. Sebastian nodded once, sharp and final. You will, he agreed, and you will do so without complaint or delay. Mr. Henshaw will provide you with the documentation outlining exactly what is owed and where it is to be transferred. You will sign an acknowledgement of the debt, and if you fail to meet any part of these terms, I will immediately file criminal charges. Am I understood? Yes, Lord Whitmore whispered. Yes, Your Grace. Understood. Lady Whitmore remained silent, her face a mask of impotent rage. But Arabella was not finished, was not satisfied with the financial settlement alone. Say my name, she said, looking directly at Lady Whitmore, and her voice was steady, but underneath it Sebastian could hear the tremor of emotion, 10 years of silence finally breaking. I am Arabella Fairfax. Say it. Acknowledge it. Admit that I exist. Lady Whitmore's mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes glittering with hatred, and she remained stubbornly silent. Say it, Sebastian repeated, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. Or I walk directly to the magistrate's office and file charges regardless of the restitution. Your choice, madam. Acknowledge Miss Fairfax's name and identity or face prosecution. The ultimatum hung in the air, and Lady Whitmore's face went through several transformations, rage and humiliation, and finally defeated acceptance. And when she spoke, the words seemed to be dragged from her against her will. Miss Arabella Fairfax. She said, each word bitter as gall, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. Arabella closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Sebastian saw tears glistening on her lashes, though her expression remained composed. Thank you, she said quietly. That is all I ever wanted. To exist, to be acknowledged, to have my name spoken with the respect due to any human being. You took that from me for 10 years, but I have it back now. I am Arabella Fairfax, and I will never again allow anyone to make me invisible. The power in the room had shifted utterly, the Whitmores seated and defeated, Arabella standing tall beside Sebastian, and Mr. Henshaw began laying out documents on the table, the formal agreements that would make the restitution legally binding. Sebastian watched Arabella's face and saw the complicated emotions playing across her features, triumph and grief and relief, and something that looked like exhaustion. The toll of 10 years of injustice finally being acknowledged, but the knowledge that acknowledgement could not undo what had been done, could not restore the lost decade, could not give back her youth or her parents or the life she should have had. Lord Whitmore signed the documents with a shaking hand, his defeat absolute, and Lady Whitmore remained rigid and silent, her dreams of marrying Lydia to a duke dissolving into ash, and Lydia wept quietly by the window, understanding that her family's social position was irreparably damaged even without a public trial, that whispers would spread, that the Duke's sudden coldness toward them would be noticed and speculated about, that their prospects were ruined. When the documents were signed and witnessed, Sebastian gathered them up and turned to Arabella. You have what you are owed, he said gently. Your inheritance and your name. What happens next is entirely your choice. You are free, Arabella. You never have to set foot in this house again. You never have to see these people again. You are independent and the world is open to you. She looked at him, at the man who had believed her when she could barely believe herself, who had fought for her when she had no weapons to fight with, who had given her back not just her money, but her voice, her identity, her right to exist. And she felt such overwhelming gratitude and love that she could barely speak around it. Thank you, she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate but having no others. Thank you, Sebastian. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and together they walked out of the Whitmore drawing-room, leaving the family to their shame and their defeat, and as Arabella crossed the threshold, she felt as though she were walking out of a tomb, emerging from 10 years of burial into sunlight and air and the possibility of a future she could choose for herself. The afternoon light was golden as they descended the steps to Sebastian's waiting carriage, and Arabella paused on the pavement and looked back at the townhouse that had been her prison. And she felt no affection, no nostalgia, only a profound relief that she would never again have to enter it as anything other than a visitor, never again have to efface herself, never again have to pretend she did not exist. Sebastian helped her into the carriage, and they sat in silence as it rolled through the London streets toward his townhouse, where she would stay as his guest until she decided what she wanted to do with her reclaimed life. And Arabella leaned her head against the cushioned seat and closed her eyes and let herself feel everything she had been holding back during the confrontation, the fear and the triumph and the grief for all the years that could never be returned. "You were magnificent," Sebastian said softly, and she opened her eyes to find him watching her with an expression of such tender pride that it made her heart ache. "You stood there and claimed yourself, claimed your name. You were so strong, Arabella." "I was terrified," she admitted. "My hands were shaking so badly I thought everyone could see." They could not, he assured her. All they saw was a woman who knew her worth, who refused to be diminished, who demanded the respect she deserved. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I could not have done it without you," she said. "Without knowing you believed me, without your support, I would never have had the courage to stand up to them." "You would have," Sebastian said with quiet certainty. "Eventually, you would have found your voice because it was always there. I simply helped you remember it was yours to use." They sat hand in hand as the carriage carried them toward whatever came next, toward a future that was uncertain, but finally her own to choose. And Arabella Fairfax, daughter of Emmeline and Thomas, woman of independent means and reclaimed identity, allowed herself to hope that the best parts of her life might still be ahead of her rather than lost in the past she could never recover. Arabella had been living in the boarding house for gentlewomen on Russell Square for 3 weeks, and the strangeness of it had not diminished. The profound disorientation of having money and freedom and choices after a decade of having none of those things. And she found herself frozen by the simplest decisions, standing in front of her wardrobe unable to determine which dress to wear because they were all hers, all purchased with her own money, all chosen by her own preference, rather than assigned to her by someone else's judgment of what was appropriate for a servant. The boarding house was respectable if modest, run by a widow named Mrs. Pemberton, who asked no intrusive questions and maintained an atmosphere of genteel propriety, and Arabella's room was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking the square's garden and furniture that was worn but clean, and every morning she woke in the narrow bed and experienced a moment of panic before remembering that she was free, that this was her life now, that she could get up or stay abed as she chose, could read or walk or do absolutely nothing, and no one would criticize her, no one would slap her, no one would tell her she was ungrateful or worthless or invisible. She had purchased new clothes with careful economy, dresses of good quality but simple design, in colors that suited her, soft blues and warm browns, and a deep green that reminded her of the book Sebastian had sent, the book that had started everything. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a woman of 32 with amber eyes and chestnut hair streaked with grey, a woman who looked almost respectable, almost like someone who belonged in the world rather than existed on its margins. She had begun the delicate process of reclaiming her place in society, such as it was, visiting old family friends who had known her parents and had wondered what became of Emmeline Fairfax's daughter, and their reactions had been mixed, some welcoming her with tears and embraces, others awkward and uncertain, not quite sure how to treat a woman who had disappeared into servitude and now re-emerged with money, but no chaperone, no family, no clear position in the social hierarchy. She was gentry, yes, a woman of independent means now, but she was also 32 and unmarried. And carrying the taint of scandal, whispers had begun to circulate about the Whitmore household, about money misappropriated and a ward mistreated, and though no names were mentioned directly, everyone seemed to know that Arabella Fairfax was somehow at the centre of it, and that the Duke of Ashford had involved himself in her affairs in a way that raised eyebrows and spawned speculation. Sebastian called on her regularly, arriving in his ducal carriage with flowers and invitations to the theatre, to gallery exhibitions, to afternoon drives in Hyde Park, and each visit left Arabella more unsettled than the last, because she could not reconcile the reality of his continued attention with her certainty that such attention must eventually end, that he would realize what a mistake it would be to bind himself to someone like her, and would withdraw with polite excuses, leaving her more devastated than if he had never shown interest at all. The fear grew inside her like a living thing, fed by 10 years of being told she was worthless, that she had no value beyond her utility as a servant, and no amount of money or new dresses could erase that internalized conviction that she was fundamentally undeserving of love, of happiness, of a future that included someone like Sebastian Wentworth. She began to pull back, to create distance between them with small but deliberate gestures, addressing him as Your Grace instead of Sebastian, declining some of his invitations with vague excuses about fatigue or prior commitments, maintaining a careful formality in their conversations that kept him at arm's length. And she saw the confusion and hurt in his eyes, but could not stop herself, could not risk letting him closer when she knew with terrible certainty that closeness would only make the eventual abandonment more unbearable. The confrontation came on a grey afternoon in late June, when rain streamed down the windows of Mrs. Pemberton's parlour, and Sebastian arrived with roses, pink and white and perfect, and an invitation to a musical that evening at the home of a duchess who was known for her intellectual salons and progressive politics. Arabella received him in the parlour with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral, and she thanked him for the flowers with a politeness that was almost painful in its distance. "You have been very kind, Your Grace," she said, "but I fear I must decline your invitation this evening. I am not quite feeling myself. Perhaps another time." Sebastian set the roses on the table with controlled precision and turned to look at her, and she saw frustration flickering across his features. "Sebastian," he said, his voice tight. "You call me Sebastian. We have been beyond formality for months now. Why are you suddenly retreating behind titles and politeness as though we are strangers?" Arabella looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I think it is best if we maintain proper formality, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is more appropriate given our respective positions." The silence that followed was charged with tension, and when Sebastian spoke again, his voice was sharp with hurt and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. "Why are you retreating from me?" "I thought, after everything, I thought we had—" He broke off, searching for words. "I thought you felt something for me, as I feel for you." She forced herself to look at him then, to meet those grey eyes that had seen her when no one else did, and she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, but she could not, would not let them fall. "Because this is not real," she said, and her voice was shaking but determined. "You felt sorry for me, Sebastian. You saw an injustice and you corrected it, as any good man would, as any decent person would. But that is not love. That is nobility, literally. You are a duke doing what dukes do, protecting the weak, righting wrongs. But I will not be your charity case forever. I will not be the poor, mistreated servant you felt sorry for, the project you took on to prove your own goodness." Sebastian stared at her as though she had struck him, his face going pale and then flushing with anger. "Is that truly what you think?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "That I have done all this out of pity, out of some aristocratic obligation to correct injustice? You think I spent months investigating your case, visiting that God-forsaken house, and enduring Lady Whitmore's obsequious attempts to throw her daughter at me, finding every excuse to speak with you, listening to your stories, learning your mind because of duty?" "Yes," Arabella said, forcing the word out, though it felt like swallowing glass. "Or perhaps curiosity. Or perhaps you found the situation novel. A servant who was not really a servant, a woman with education trapped in servitude. It was interesting, compelling even, but interesting is not love. Sebastian, and eventually the novelty will wear off, and you will see me as I truly am, a woman of no particular family, with a decade of servitude behind her and scandal attached to her name. And you will regret ever involving yourself in my affairs." He took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides. "You are telling me what I feel," he said, his voice rising. "You are deciding for me what my emotions are and what they mean. You spent 10 years being told who you are by people who wanted to diminish you, and now you are doing the same thing to me, telling me that my feelings cannot possibly be real, that I cannot possibly love you because you have decided you are unworthy of love." "I am being realistic," Arabella shot back, standing to face him. "You are a duke, one of the most powerful men in England. You could marry anyone, any beautiful, accomplished woman of impeccable family. Why would you choose me, a woman who was recently a servant? We do not live in a fairy story, Sebastian. This is reality, and in reality, dukes do not marry penniless orphans with scandal attached to their names." "No," Sebastian said, and his voice was cold now, icy with controlled fury. "We live in reality, and in reality I am in love with you, not with saving you, not with the idea of you, not with the project of restoring your inheritance, but with you, Arabella, with your mind that challenges mine, with your strength that survived a decade of cruelty without becoming cruel yourself, with your kindness that persisted despite having every reason to be bitter, with your laugh that I have only heard 3 times, and I would cross England to hear it again, with the way you say my name as though it means something beyond a title, as though I am Sebastian and not the Duke, as though I am a person and not a position." Arabella felt tears streaming down her face, her composure completely shattered. "You cannot possibly," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Do not," he said, each word clipped and precise. "Do not tell me what I can and cannot feel. You have spent 10 years being told who you are and what you deserve, and all of it was lies. Do not compound that injustice by telling me that my love for you is somehow false or misguided or the product of pity. I know my own heart, Arabella, and I am offering it to you freely, not as a duke to a rescued servant, but as a man to a woman he loves. And if you cannot accept that, if you cannot believe that you are worthy of being loved for yourself rather than pitied for your circumstances, then that is your choice. But do not make it mine. Do not decide for me that I am incapable of genuine feeling." The words hung in the air between them, brutal in their honesty, and Arabella stood trembling with her hands pressed to her face, unable to speak, unable to process the enormity of what he was saying, because accepting it would mean accepting that she was worthy, that she deserved love, that the decade of being told she was nothing had been a lie, and the terror of believing that, of letting herself hope, was almost more than she could bear. "I cannot," she whispered. "I cannot let myself believe this, Sebastian. Because if I do, if I let myself love you and trust you and believe that this is real, and then you realize your mistake and leave,